A dramatic move to take power in Venezuela falters. The president says he's crushed an attempted coup, but the opposition leader maintains an uprising has only just begun. Who's backing them, and what's next in this political crisis? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Imran Khan. Venezuela's president is hailing victory after what he calls an attempted coup. Nicolas Maduro is promising to prosecute those behind a dramatic attempt to remove him from office. On Tuesday, opposition leader Juan Guaido called on the army to oust Maduro. But by the end of the day, Guaido was in hiding and dozens of people were injured in scuffles with security forces. Both sides are urging their supporters to hold more protests. Guaido has the backing of more than 50 countries, including the United States, which is calling for a peaceful transition of power. But Secretary of State Mike Pompeo warned military action is possible if that's what's required. We'll get to our discussion in a moment, but first, this report from our Latin America editor, Lucia Newman.
It was perhaps his boldest move yet, opposition leader Juan Guaido appearing before dawn in front of a Caracas Air Force base, surrounded by some 25 soldiers, appealing to the military to join him. By his side was Leopoldo Lopez, perhaps Venezuela's most famous political prisoner. He announced he'd been released from house arrest by security forces who'd turned against President Nicolas Maduro.
Defend freedom, out with tyranny, everyone out onto the street.
Opposition supporters answered the call, but were pushed back by security forces. Dozens were injured in clashes between pro and anti-government groups. After he and Lopez took part in a march, Guaido disappeared from sight, amid nagging rumors that he'd be arrested. But come nightfall, he issued a new call from an undisclosed location for Venezuelans to rise up again.
We will continue calling on the armed forces to take part in the final phase of Operation Liberty to rescue our dignity. That is why on May 1, we will go back onto the streets nationwide, gathering in the areas we have already designated.
President Maduro responded on nationwide television, surrounded by army officers on whose continued support he depends.
This was truly a fake coup, a minor scuffle, a simulation and lie. That's why 80% of the military and police who joined them in the beginning had left them by noon.
But amid reports that his support may be cracking, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said Maduro had been about to step down and go to Cuba, but was dissuaded by Russia, another key ally. Maduro says that's rubbish. And adding more fuel to the geopolitical crisis, President Donald Trump is again pointing the finger at Cuba. He is warning Havana that unless it immediately withdraw what he calls military help to the Maduro regime, he will slap on what he is now describing as a full and complete embargo, as well as heightened economic and financial sanctions. In Venezuela, Guaido and Maduro are both planning to mark International Workers' Day with a major show of strength on the streets. One to try to force the president from power, the other to try to maintain it. Lucia Newman, Al Jazeera, Havana.
Let's bring in our panel. Joining me on Skype from Miami, Ramon Muchacho, former mayor of Chacao District, which is an opposition stronghold in Caracas. From Merida, Venezuela, also on Skype, Paul Dobson, journalist at VenezuelaAnalysis.com. And from Warwick in the UK, Tom Long, Professor of South American Politics at Warwick University. Welcome all to the programme. I want to bring in Ramon Muchacho in first. I saw Guaido on TV, as we all did, a very bold statement, a very grand statement that the attempted coup was underway. Now he's in hiding. Is this it for him? Is he finished?
Well, no. I mean, what happened yesterday in Venezuela was a try by President Guaido to move forward and put the Maduro regime in a situation where the military around him will just need to recognize Guaido as the president. I mean, this is not, I mean, the situation in Venezuela, it's really hard and really difficult to understand. Many things moving at the same time, but Guaido is trying to push the military to change sides. This is not easy. We don't know if that's going to happen anytime soon, but Guaido plus Leopoldo Lopez and the opposition is trying hard to reach that goal.
Let's bring in Paul Dobson here in Merida in Venezuela. Paul, Maduro must be thinking that he's got the upper hand right now.
Without a doubt, I think the events of yesterday can only be considered a failure for Guaido. The fact that only 15 soldiers heeded his call to rebel against their chain of command is definitely a victory for Maduro. The fact that Maduro didn't feel the need to come out and speak to the nation until the evening as well shows that there's a certain level of calm within his office. There was definitely no panic from the government, and I think they would definitely feel that it was a victory for their side yesterday.
Tom Long in Warwick. Maduro has the support of not only 50 countries, but the US, Guaido has the support of the US as well. So 50 countries, the US, yet still, this coup seems to be faltering. It's full of false starts. In your opinion, as a South American specialist, is this just par for the course, or do you think he's actually faltering and this is getting towards the end of the situation in Venezuela?
Well, I think there's been a bit of a tendency to try to interpret what's happening in Venezuela through a lens of great power politics, that this is really about the U.S., Russia, and China squaring off in Venezuela. But I think the events of yesterday and really the events of the last few months show that the determinant factors for what happens in Venezuela are located within Venezuela. And so I don't think that this situation is over yet, though yesterday was not a good day for Guaido. But a lot of the underlying problems are still there and unchanged.
It's a very interesting point. Ramon, I want to bring you in here. It's not quite the end, but yesterday was a bad day for Guaido, seems to be what we're hearing right now. But has he got the support within the country? If this isn't about international power play between Russia, China and the US, he needs the support internally. Do you think he has that support, and why hasn't it shown itself in greater number?
Yeah, there's no doubt Juan Guaido has a very strong and large support, popular support in Venezuela. Most Venezuelans want change, and as you know, we're having in the middle of a great humanitarian crisis. What we saw yesterday was not a coup attempt, but an attempt by Guaido to be recognized as the legitimate president and start a transition in Venezuela, a transition back to democracy and to have fair elections. The main thing Guaido has, it's a strong popular support. He's not having military support yet, and that's the only thing he really needs, the only additional thing he needs to move forward and transition back to democracy and open Venezuela to receive international help and some financing that is much needed to rebuild the country. But again, right now, key point, military support. Guaido is not having the military support he needs yet. We don't know how long will this take, but there's no way to resolve the Venezuelan crisis without getting Maduro out of power. I mean, there's no way out of the humanitarian crisis and the political crisis with Maduro in Miraflores. With Maduro in Miraflores, we'll keep seeing this same movie, terror movie, I should say, we're watching in Venezuela.
But Ramon, if, as you say, he does have popular support, then why hasn't that translated to support within the army? Surely the army know which way the wind is blowing.
Yeah, well, listen, it's a great question. We don't have an army as an institution. I mean, we had one in Venezuela, but there's no an army as an organized institution that it's under the Constitution. What we have, there's a bunch of people with arms, but they are obedient not to the Constitution, but to Maduro and to Chavez and to the revolution. So that's a key point. Chavez systematically destroyed the armed forces in Venezuela. And there's no way, I mean, it has been very difficult for them to react. They have been trying. I mean, there's a lot of discontent inside the armed forces. And we know that, like these guys yesterday or a month ago, we got a small rebellion in Cotiza, and we have been, here and there, military stepping forward, and there are like more than 500 military in Colombia. They crossed the border to support Guaido. So I mean, there's a lot of discontent, but but there's no way for them out. There's no way to transform that discontent inside the military in an institutional answer to this problem, in an institutional move forward to get rid of Maduro and support Guaido.
Paul Dobson, let me bring you in here. Ramon Muchacho is saying it's just a matter of time. The army will change its mind, and this is about tactics and just, in some ways, a waiting game. Do you believe that?
Well, I think no. I think any change in the political line of Venezuela has to come through elections, has to come through the ballot box. Venezuela is, in fact, one of the most democratic countries in the world, with around 20 elections in the last 18 or 19 years. All of these elections have been observed by independent international observers who have declared them to be free and fair. So I think if the Venezuelans want to change the political course of their country, they have a chance to do it, and this is through an election.
Yeah, there's no way to have free elections in Venezuela. And like the last elections we had, I mean, all these problems start when Maduro tried to swear as president after an election that was not recognized by the democratic world. I mean, there's no way to have fair elections in Venezuela with Maduro in power. Just no way. And we didn't recognize the opposition was barred from participating in the last elections. Even Leopoldo Lopez, for example, or Enrique Capriles, main opposition leaders, were unable to even run as candidates to present themselves. I mean, that's what's going on in Venezuela. So we need to get rid of Maduro, who is a dictator, and then start a transition that will get us to free and fair elections with the international community monitoring that. And
let me bring in Tom Long here. We've heard both of our guests there arguing the pro and anti-Maduro point of view, or pro-Guaido point of view. But we've heard the words peaceful transition of power. There needs to be elections. In your opinion, why didn't that happen before? And is it possible with the political landscape as it currently is?
Well, I would say that political scientists are largely in agreement that elections in Venezuela have gotten less free and fair for all sorts of reasons, as a sort of gradual process of the consolidation of power by the Chavista government. One point regarding the military as well is I think it's important to remember that the military is not a monolithic institution, either in terms of how it is organized or in terms of the politics of people within the military. So part of the events of yesterday were not just to see whether the military as a whole would swing one way or the other, but to see whether the military might fragment, or indeed whether divisions within the Maduro government would come to light. Coming back to your question about a negotiated transition, yes, I think that it is possible still, though after the events of yesterday, the immediate context for it is not particularly favorable. That is some sort of a negotiation in which Maduro would allow greater representation of the opposition. First of all, it's not clear for years that Maduro has been interested in doing anything along those lines, but the events of yesterday give him very little motivation to do so unless he's given a strong push in that direction by other figures within the government or the military.
That's a very interesting point. Paul Dobson, I want to bring you in here. If he's so confident, if Maduro is so confident that he has the popular support of the people, why not just call an election and be done with it?
Well, I think to some extent it's a question of pride. Venezuela has its constitution. Venezuela had its elections. Why should he call new elections just because Donald Trump and John Bolton are calling, and Ramon Muchacho are calling for him to do so? Venezuela had 3 elections last year, and to some extent, the Venezuelans had their opportunity to elect. They had 2 left-wing candidates, 2 right-wing candidates. The fact that some parties decided not to participate doesn't necessarily mean that the elections were unfair. There was an opportunity for everyone to participate within the realms of Venezuelan law. So Maduro basically says, why do we need to? You know, we're not anybody's lackeys. We're not a colony of the United States. We had our elections, and our law says that the mandate now lasts until 2025, unless there is a recall referendum.
Ramon Muchacho, what's your response to that?
Well, just let me point out that the Organization of American States just kicked out Maduro's representative and welcomed Gustavo Tarre-Briceño, Guaido's representative, representing now the Venezuelan government, because the governments of the region just recognized publicly that there were not elections, not fair elections in Venezuela. So, you know, that's a very hard fact. It's very unusual to see something like this happening in a place like the Organization of American States. But it's a very hard point. I mean, there's no democracy in Venezuela. There were no elections. There's no way to have elections with Maduro. And we need to get Maduro out of power to be able to move to a transition back to democracy. It's a very hard fact.
Tom Long in Warwickshire, broadening this out to the regional governments, they must be looking at Venezuela right now and wondering what on earth is going on, but wondering what influence they have. Who are the big players, and what are they looking for as an outcome for Venezuela?
Well, I think one of the immediate outcomes that countries in South America are concerned about is the refugee crisis. If you look at a country like Colombia, it's had more than 1 million Venezuelans come across the border. And this is a huge issue for Colombia. Colombia, of course, is going through its own peace process, and instability in border regions, many of which were at the center of the Colombian conflict and continue to be at the center of all sorts of dynamics of organized crime, contribute to instability and make it really difficult to consolidate any sort of a meaningful peace. So that's a massive issue for Colombia, for Brazil, but really for the entire region. So stability is paramount. Also, you certainly have countries with ideological interests at stake. That's become very clear in Brazil with the positioning of Bolsonaro, as well as the PT, where Venezuela has essentially become an extension of domestic political battles within Brazil. So this is a huge issue for different reasons, but perhaps one where those countries are exercising less influence than they had hoped. Part of that is because as long as the Maduro government is able to continue to have access to some sort of resources through the sale of oil, even if that's diminished, and it's able to maintain a relatively high degree of control over the armed forces, it's able to consolidate and hold on to its position of de facto power within Venezuela quite effectively.
Let me bring in Ramon Muchacho here. Ramon, one of the outcomes that certainly the US is discussing in a wider sense rather than at a congressional or political sense is this idea that US troops may well intervene within the Venezuelan conflict, the Venezuelan situation right now. You don't want this to turn into an armed conflict in Venezuela just for the sake of getting Guaido into power, do you?
I don't know if I got your question. If it's about the possibility of the U.S. using force or sending troops to Venezuela, I think that's it will be very difficult to get to that point. I think sending troops to Venezuela right now will be part of a larger debate in the middle of a political campaign in the U.S. I don't see the U.S. government sending troops to Venezuela anytime soon, and I think Maduro is counting on that, and I think the Russians and the Cubans are counting on that too. So that's probably why Maduro looks so relaxed about what's going on. I think he's really, really sure that will never happen. And Colombia and Brazil, as your other guest was saying, they're suffering for the migrant crisis, but they are more than willing to keep dealing with that crisis instead of sending troops to Venezuela. Colombia and Brazil are much farther than the U.S. from that possibility. So I don't foresee any action of force, any international troops going to Venezuela anytime soon. However, I do think that's a possibility that should remain on the table, and that I don't see any other way to get rid of Maduro, by the way. I mean, this is so hard, so complex. I don't see any other way to get out of Maduro right now.
Paul Dobson, there's no other way of getting rid of Maduro unless there's real military options on the table by the US. Is Maduro worried about this?
Well, I mean, this is a position from a coup monger. Any sort of Democrat would say elections, but, we've already talked about this. So I think, I think Maduro is definitely worried about the threats of US action, both overt and covert. We can't really talk about US intervention in Venezuela without talking about covert action as well, which has been going on for some time. For example, we only saw today that the US have banned low-flying aircrafts in Venezuelan airspace, which is historically is a precursor to airstrikes. So this is a very worrying piece of news coming out of the White House. But the main point here, Imran, is the following. Are the US genuinely preparing for some sort of armed intervention in Venezuela, or are these sorts of actions they're taking mere pressure tactics to try to change the dynamics of power internally in Venezuela, intervene, let's say, without actually pulling the trigger? This is a question which we're trying to figure out here in Venezuela. And most Venezuelans, the vast majority, are staunchly opposed to any sort of foreign intervention, be it American, Colombian, Brazilian, or from any other country. So this will definitely meet great resistance if the US did decide to send troops on the ground to Venezuela.
Tom Long in Warwickshire, is the Russian, US and Chinese role helpful at all in this situation?
No, I don't think it's particularly helpful in finding a resolution. Certainly, U.S. saber rattling, I think, is intended to create the sort of a shadow of a threat to see whether that will change some minds, not of Maduro directly so much as the minds of those who surround him. But I don't think it's likely to be a particularly effective threat. U.S. threats yesterday against Cuba, I think, are very unlikely to change Cuba's position in Venezuela. And Russia, which has, to my mind, largely used Venezuela as a way to poke a finger in the United States' eye, is not taking on a particularly helpful role here either. There are some serious proposals to try to act as mediators from the Lima Group or from Mexico and Uruguay. The problem with that has been that there is a total lack of trust between the two sides who would be sitting across the table from one another, and for some very good reasons. The opposition doesn't feel like previous negotiations with Maduro were really done in good faith. But having the United States kind of rattling the saber at Venezuela doesn't make it much easier to start that process of dialogue either.
I just want to thank all our guests. We are running out of time. Ramon Muchacho, Paul Dobson and Tom Long, thank you very much. And thank you as well for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Imran Khan, and the whole team here, bye for now.